On May 2nd, Paul is swimming on the French coast. Suddenly he feels strange bubbles in the water and he looks up, only to discover that the clouds are moving in a mysterious circle. Paul doesn't notice that the bubbles are forming a circle around him too, and they quickly disappear. Later at home, Paul tries to cook but discovers that the kitchen faucet isn't working. He goes to the basement to take a look at the water heater and his daughter Mia rushes to join him. Paul has to be careful with the door to keep their cat Tofu out. In the basement, Paul works on the repairs while Mia plays with her toys on top of a fish tank. She wants to get more fish because she only has one, but Paul refuses, explaining things are already complicated enough with Tofu. When Mia comes closer to hand Paul a tool, she gets scared because she sees a spider. However, Paul won't kill it since he considers spiders useful, and he assures his daughter that a spider won't hurt her. He grabs her and pretends he's a monster that will eat her to make her laugh before sending her upstairs. When he stops to grab a bottle of wine, he finds mice droppings behind the furniture. After dinner, Paul's wife Elise plays some music and dances with Mia in the living room to teach her that there isn't a wrong way to do it. Once Mia is asleep, Elise dances with Paul, which soon escalates into getting naughty. On May 5th, Paul wakes up very abruptly, feeling a bit strange. He tries on different shirts, yet all of them are a bit too long on him. After a hard day at work, he has dinner with his family and Mia asks him to read to her before bed. Paul says no because he's very tired and promises to do it tomorrow, but Mia points out he said the same thing yesterday and leaves the table. Elise scolds her husband for his attitude, so he goes to Mia's bedroom to read to her. However, they start arguing over the size of the meteorite in the story, so Paul doesn't finish the tale and asks Mia to sleep. When Paul is about to leave, Mia gets off the bed and lies down on the floor instead, begging her father to play along until he agrees. Paul picks her up by her legs and shakes her a bit to make her laugh before putting her back on the bed. On May 7th, Paul's shirts look even bigger on him, and Elise wonders if he's lost weight. Paul rudely points out that losing weight doesn't change the length of your limbs, and Elise complains about his tone before wondering if his body is going through something serious. Paul decides to visit the doctor, who does a general checkup and measures his height. Paul is shocked to hear him say 176, explaining he's been 180 since he was young. After asking him a few questions, the doctor concludes that it's just Paul's age catching up to him, but Paul is skeptical. Later at work, Paul notices that his helmet keeps slipping off his head. He double checks that he didn't grab the wrong one and sees his name inside the helmet. In the middle of the night, Paul can't sleep and keeps thinking about the strange clouds. He decides to exercise to try to tire himself out. Elise comes to check on him and convinces him to come back to bed. On May 20th, Paul is washing up and notices that the shower head is too high. Suddenly his wedding ring falls from his finger and he stares at his hand in shock. When he goes to the kitchen, Elise discovers that her husband is now shorter than her. This time Paul goes to the hospital so the doctors can put him through a bunch of tests, from full body scan to blood tests. A few hours later, a doctor tells Paul that all the results are normal. However, his height is now 165 and he weighs 63 kilograms, which means he's lost 15 centimeters and 10 kilos in just a few weeks. Unfortunately, the doctor has never seen a case like this before and has no explanation, but she does think that the shrinking has been consistent and it'll keep happening. Afterward, more tests. Paul can't stop thinking about the hospital, blood, and the strange clouds, to the point that these things haunt his dreams. When he wakes up in the hospital after another nightmare, he decides he's wasting his time and leaves. At home, Paul is extra aware of his size because his feet don't touch the floor when he sits. He also feels disconnected from his family and ignores the phone calls from the hospital. Eventually he's so small that he looks like a doll on the chair. Elise thinks they should move and leave Mia with her grandparents until they solve the issue, but when she asks Paul where he wants to go, he sarcastically answers the circus. Tofu's threatening presence is starting to get on his nerves, so Elise sends the cat outside and locks the pet door. On June 30th, Paul is the size of a cell phone. Tofu stares at him through the window, so obsessed that he isn't bothered by the rain. When Elise arrives with potential house buyers and shows them around, Paul panics and rushes to hide under the bed, devastated to hear them talk about his precious home like some product. After the guests are gone, Paul yells at Elise for not telling him that people were coming since it could be dangerous for him to be seen. He's also angry that she's selling the house without consulting him, so Elise points out that she did mention the idea. Paul just keeps yelling and says this is his house, so Elise has to remind him that they don't have an income anymore. She doesn't know what else to do since Paul refuses to get treatment and her words cause him to snap. He says that treatment is for sick people but he is perfectly healthy, so he doesn't want to become a guinea pig for some random lab. Elise ends up snapping too, and when she yells, the force of her voice is so strong that it almost throws Paul off the counter. She apologizes and runs out of the house. When Paul looks at the corridor, he discovers that Mia has watched the whole argument. On July 5th, Mia puts Paul in her dollhouse and he plays along, complimenting the house and its amenities as if it was a real building. He even asks Mia to play some music so he can dance with the doll. This makes Mia smile, which hadn't happened in a while. Then she tries to play monster like they used to, but her voice and gestures being directed at his tiny body are overwhelming for him. Mia's smile immediately disappears and she apologizes. That night, Elise can't sleep. When Paul approaches the bed, she offers her hand and he steps on it to join her. On July 30th, Paul is barely bigger than a cork. While he's building something with a thread and a fishing hook, Tofu keeps pushing the pet door from outside until he manages to open it. He comes inside and startles Paul, who accidentally falls on top of the hook and ends up getting hurt. Paul carefully removes the hook from his stomach and takes his shirt off to look at his wound, but he can't take care of it now because Tofu is getting into his hunting position. After grabbing a needle, Paul starts running away and Tofu chases after him. Paul tries to lose him by walking through the dollhouse, however Tofu jumps over it and continues the chase. Then Paul reaches the basement door and rolls under it to hide. Unfortunately, Tofu extends its paw under the door and swats at him, causing him to fall off the stairs. Paul lands safely inside a box full of trash but still passes out. Moments later, Elise comes home and sees the bloodstained shirt, so she assumes the worst. At the same time, Paul wakes up and starts yelling Elise's name. Soon she comes downstairs and looks around, but she can't see or hear Paul. Tofu also comes and purrs when he says his prey, causing Elise to turn around. She assumes Tofu has eaten her husband and chases the cat up the stairs while yelling at him. Paul throws some things around, furious at being ignored. In the middle of the night, Paul gets tired of waiting and starts looking for ways to survive. First he cuts a piece of fabric on a nail to cover his body and some wire becomes a belt. Then he looks around the box until he finds a hole in the side, so he finally comes out. After picking up his needle, he starts making his way to the window, only to freeze when he hears something moving in the shadows. Soon panic takes over and Paul runs to climb on top of the water heater's platform. Sadly, he can't use the window because it's covered by a mosquito net. The pipe is leaking again, so he drinks some water and washes his body, especially the wound. Too afraid to move further in the darkness, he ends up falling asleep under the water heater. The next morning, Paul wakes up to the sound of Mia calling for him. He runs to the stairs but they're too high for him to climb, so he yells Mia's name back to no avail. Suddenly he hears the front door and the car's engine, which means his family has left. Afterward he looks around for anything useful and finds a piece of chalk, which he uses to write his name on the floor. Next he searches the space between the furniture and the wall and finds ants eating the cheese from a mousetrap. He pushes them away with his needle, then he drops a nail on the trap to try to activate it. At first nothing happens, so Paul tries again and this time the trap does snap closed. Now he can eat all the cheese he wants. At that moment, a spider appears above him, so Paul repeatedly bangs the nail on the walls to make lots of noise, causing the spider to leave. Then Paul tries to open a hole in another box using the nail, but it doesn't work. He returns to the trash box and grabs a piece of fabric plus a bottle cap, which he fills with water. Now he can get the fabric wet and uses it to soften the cardboard. When he hits it with the nail again, he finally opens a hole. He moves inside and finds a box of matches, but he can't reach them because big things are in the way that he can't move. After using an eraser to block the hole, Paul tries to sleep. He hears noises upstairs before the lights go out, so he wonders who is in the house now. On July 15th, Paul is awakened by voices in the house. He starts yelling and making noise with a nail and a paper clip, trying to get their attention. The door opens, but the people only take a quick peek into the basement before leaving. Paul collapses on the floor, feeling defeated. Desperate to forget about his sorrows, Paul uses the needle to mess with the cork of a bottle until wine starts leaking. He quickly fills up a thimble and gets drunk until he throws up. He can see the spider watching him from the top of the fish tank, and he's so drunk that he tells Mia's doll that he'll take care of this. Paul climbs to the top of the fish tank too and the spider only watches him for a second before running away. Laughing at his victory, Paul gets distracted, allowing the spider to come back and push him into the water. After staring at the fish, Paul swims to the surface, only to find the spider waiting for him. He goes underwater again and swims with the fish while waiting for the spider to leave. Moments later Paul throws some fish food into the tank and decides to try it too, but it tastes disgusting. That night Paul is coming back from filling his cap at the water heater and finds the spider waiting under the fish tank. The critter begins approaching him and Paul pulls out his needle, swinging around to keep his enemy at bay. He manages to hit its legs a few times, but the spider refuses to give up. Paul runs to hide behind a furniture leg and the spider immediately follows him, so he pokes it with a needle a few times until it moves away. However, the spider climbs the wooden leg and tries to attack him from above, so Paul pokes it once before running away. Now the chase continues under the furniture and Paul ends up tripping on the cables. The spider climbs on top of him, so Paul tries his best to defend himself. When he sees some wood chips, he grabs one and stabs the critter's eyes until it steps away from him. When Paul yells at it, it runs away to hide. Afterward Paul manages to make a new hole in the box and finally reaches the matches. Since his tiny body isn't very strong, it takes him a few tries and various matches to finally get a flame. Now he can start a small bonfire to stay warm. He eats cheese while talking to Mia's doll, mentioning how much he misses his family and asking the doll to pass his message to Mia if it ever sees her again. As days pass, Paul keeps himself healthy by doing exercise, eating cheese, and sleeping inside the box. On July 20th, he hears a noise and rushes to the stairs to see a man coming down. He tries to yell and waves his arms, but he's become so tiny that the guy's voice and steps are overwhelming for him even at a normal volume. He covers his ears with his hands and runs to hide behind the stairs, dealing with a terrible headache that leaves him crying on the floor. When the man finally leaves, Paul comes out and discovers that the fish is gone, so now he's truly alone. On August 2nd, a mosquito enters the basement through the window and stares at Paul for a few seconds, making him realize he's almost as small as a bug. When the mosquito flies away, Paul wonders if this size could help him pass through the mosquito net on the window. He starts climbing the furniture, which takes him a very long time and lots of energy. Eventually he makes it to the top, where he runs as fast as possible to jump over the edge and land on the bricks. Now he can simply walk on the wall to make his way to the window. When he encounters a cobweb, he discovers that the spider is still living there. He moves carefully to avoid disturbing the web, but unfortunately he accidentally brushes it with his elbow, and that's enough to alert the spider. The critter immediately comes after him and Paul lowers his head, ready to accept the end. As he starts crying, he ends up wetting his pants as well. The spider stares at him in confusion until a fly gets stuck on the cobweb, causing it to leave the man and run to its web to eat. Paul keeps walking, and after some effort, he finally reaches the window. However, when he tries to crawl through the net, he discovers that his body is still too big and he can't escape. On August 7th, Paul is startled awake by an ant nibbling his leg. He kicks it to make it run, so the ant is caught by the spider instead. A second ant immediately escapes through the net, and Paul is finally small enough to follow it. He moves quickly and avoids the spider just in time. They stare at each other and Paul wonders if the spider feels alone now. Moments later, Paul is walking in the midst of nature. Grass is quite higher than him and the water drops are enormous. The breeze caused by a butterfly flying caresses Paul's face, and they stare at each other for a few seconds before the butterfly flies away. Then Paul looks at the stars and thinks of Mia, who is currently looking at the stars too. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.